It's very hard.
No, they don't. So from playing footsie with conspiracy theorists, flash forward to today. And this display again at Trump's rally comes after weeks of Trump promoting QAnon content on his social media site, Truth Social, in the wake of the FBI search of his private club and residence. New York Times is reporting this, quote, last week, for example, Trump posted an image of himself on Truth Social wearing a Q pin on his lapel and under a slogan reading, quote, the storm is coming. Adherents to QAnon believe that the, quote, storm is the moment when Trump takes over again, regains power of the country after vanquishing his enemies, having them arrested and potentially executed on live TV. That's what that means, the storm. It's a mask-off moment for Donald Trump and the QAnon conspiracy theory, and it's where we begin today. Former Senator and MSNBC political analyst Claire McCaskill's here. Also joining us, Frank Figliuzzi, a former FBI Assistant Director for Counterintelligence, now an MSNBC National Security Analyst. And the former Republican Congressman David Jolly joins us. He's also an MSNBC political analyst. Well, Frank, here we go. So I saw the pictures and was horrified but not shocked. This is where we've been heading. You don't start with footsie and end up anywhere other than tangled up in the sheets together in bed, and that's where Donald Trump is right now with QAnon. What does that mean for the QAnon adherents in America?
Yeah, I saw it as well, and I was astonished by the messaging there. It's actually quite strategic, and certainly nothing spontaneous or accidental about it. When you combine the characteristics of a cult with all the trappings of a religion, you've got a very volatile, dangerous scenario on your hands. And, you know, I frequently refer to the MAGA movement as a form of cult, but clearly, if you watch that Youngstown, Ohio rally, and if you were to actually take Trump out of the video, just listen to the video just listen to the audio of the music at the last moments of the rally, plus the crowd. Watch the crowd in that kind of one word, that one finger gesture, hands raised to the heavens. You would think you're in the final moments of a evangelical worship service in some mega church that's gone mad. All that it was missing was the altar call at the end. There is a religiosity about this that's extremely disturbing. You know, there's a book out right now that essentially twists Christian theology into asserting that Trump is the Son of Man referred to in the Bible when it's intended to refer to Christ. This author seems to imply that, no, actually, there's a Son of God who's Christ, and then there's a Son of Man, and that's Trump. That's where we are today, Nicole. And when you do that, you get people who are absolutely willing to sacrifice their souls and their lives, because it's no longer about politics anymore. It's about where they're going to spend eternity. And if you've convinced people that this is the man you've got to adore and worship because it's your very soul at stake and the soul of the nation, then you're in a very dangerous situation if power is taken from him, whether it's through an indictment or another lost election. It becomes extremely dangerous.
Frank, I really wish this wasn't the news, but this is the news. And so I'm going to keep going with the FBI's latest reporting that we have on how the FBI views QAnon. This is from a June 4th, 2021 FBI threat assessment on QAnon specifically. Adherence to QAnon by some domestic violent extremists will likely be affected by factors such as the severity of the COVID-19 pandemic, the level of societal polarization in the United States, social media companies' willingness to host QAnon-related content on their sites, and the frequency and content of pro-QAnon statements by public individuals who feature prominently in core QAnon narratives. So we tick all 5 of the boxes that the FBI warned us torques up the threat that QAnon represents to America. And there's no reporting that suggests that any of the FBI threat assessments are among the documents that were at Mar-a-Lago. But clearly Trump knows this, right? Knows he's playing with fire, knows what the threat environment looks like in the United States of America.
Oh, not only do I think he knows it, but I think that's what attracts him to this. It's like a moth to the flame. And the thing is, he knows that he's increasingly cornered. He's in trouble on so many legal fronts, even criminal fronts now, that this is kind of the almost last act of a desperate man. And you can look at this and go, you know, Frank, be careful, because that Youngstown, Ohio rally was actually sparsely attended. The camera shots looked great, right? Just people are stacked up behind him and right in front of him. But largely, there was nobody otherwise in that arena. So you could say, this isn't that big a threat. And I say, yeah, I got you on the attendance issue. But what is extremely dangerous, based on past histories of cults, is that as they come near the end, as the leader is threatened, they get more and more dangerous, and they do something cult experts call forcing the end. Either the leader calls for the violence, or if the leader's taken out, the members step up and force the ending, whatever that could be. That's what concerns me. And we've learned from January 6th, it only takes a small number of people to do that.
And Frank, we know from Donald Trump's interview with Hugh Hewitt last week that he's put law enforcement on alert. He's told them, my people are going to be mad, mad, mad. And to your point, Frank, here's what an extremist expert said on CBS yesterday about, to your point, it didn't take a lot. It didn't take a lot of cult members when incited by Donald Trump and warned publicly on the Hugh Hewitt radio show to carry out the violence he's warned about.
Today, there are 13 million individuals, the equivalent, I should say, of 13 million individuals who support the use of force to restore Donald Trump to the presidency. The problem that we face is that over and over in tweets by the former president, he is deliberately stoking not just the fires of anger getting him political support, but the fires that are leading to that violent the equivalent of 13 million. And that is really the heart of our problem that we face as a threat to democracy. Because if it's just a political threat, well, then we can have elections. But once it's not just denying an election, but using violence as the response to an election denial, now we're in a new game.
So it's all part of a plan charted out on paper by people who study the rise of violent domestic extremism in societies. It just hasn't happened here in a really long time. But the denial of the election result as a political maneuver comes first, and what it precedes is violence. Frank, how do we prepare for what comes next?
So there's incremental steps that aren't even moving fast enough. The electoral count legislation that's coming up in Congress is somewhat helpful to clarify the role of the vice president and how we count the electoral college count. But look, there's a penetration strategy, infiltration of state, local, county election officials. Even add now that to over 100, something like 119 people running for office throughout the country that are election deniers. Get them in the House, the Senate, get them in key positions in key swing states as election officials. And now you've got a recipe where we may not even be able to seat a legitimately elected next president of the United States, because that's the degree of infiltration that's gone on here. And that's a recipe for violence, even as early as the midterms. That could happen. And if I go back in my career to international terrorism, it's that combination of religion and cult status that gets people to the point where they will martyr themselves. We do have a Trump death count. I wrote a column on this for MSNBC Daily, where I start counting up the people who died, from the guy who walked into the FBI Cincinnati field office to people killed at the Capitol on January 6th, and others who die because of their belief. That's more than a cult. There is this religious aspect that's extremely disturbing.
Claire, where is Rob Portman? This is the seat to replace Rob Portman in the United States Senate. Rob Portman was in the Bush White House during 9/11. He understands threats to the homeland, as well as anyone you've probably worked with on that committee and in the U.S. Senate. We looked. I didn't find any Republican condemnation of the QAnon song, the cult-like trance in which J.D. Vance's supporters at the Trump rally were positioned during that public event. And neither did I see anything over the weekend refuting the reporting in the Washington Post that a lot of Republicans, including J.D. Vance, won't commit to accepting the results of election.
Yeah, you ask what are the next steps. I think there will be three important steps that can save this country. The first would be Republican leaders rejecting this kind of scary nonsense, and that would include Rob Portman. I'm disappointed, and I think a lot of people are disappointed that when this happens in his state, he does not stand up and say, wait a minute. And there's a lot of Republicans that are leaders right now that could stand up and reject candidates that are running on a platform that says what voters decide doesn't matter. If we lose, we're not going to accept it. Republican leaders can do something about that. The second thing that could happen is law enforcement leaders could stand up. There was a lot of things that were scary about that rally. He delegitimized the rule of law and denigrated the FBI over and over again. I mean, just think about that is now not even a headline in the story, that he is standing up there and denigrating the preeminent law enforcement organization in this nation. And then the third step would be people vote and reject this stuff. I think those are the three ways that we could save this thing. But I got to tell you, the other thing that was remarkable about that rally, Nicole, I put myself in J.D. Vance's place, and there was reporting that these candidates are really reluctant to have Trump come into their state. A lot of the people that were at that rally aren't even from Ohio. I read that one woman was there that had driven 12 hours from Missouri to be there. It's like, I mean, I don't want to put down the followers of the Grateful Dead, but it's a little bit like this. People are traveling many states to go see this guy. It really is an entertainment venue and not a serious venue. But here's what's amazing. He stood at that podium when somebody is running for the United States Senate and said the following: JD is really kissing my ASS. I mean, if you're the candidate, how do you take that? How insulting. I mean, how awful that somebody who's been president stands in front of a bunch of your voters and basically says, you know, you're nothing. All you do is bow at my knee. I mean, just remarkable stuff. I have to believe that when he was saying that, J.D. Vance's stomach was in knots.
Well, I mean, nothing against J.D. Vance's stomach, but I don't know that J.D. Vance's candidacy is about much more than kissing Trump's ass, Claire. I mean, isn't he reaping what he has sowed?
Well, absolutely. But the point is that for Trump to say that kind of stuff out loud about somebody he's supposed to be helping, that doesn't make J.D. Vance look strong. I mean, the bottom line is Trump is willing to sacrifice anything and anyone to promote himself. It doesn't matter if it's a candidate he's supporting or if it's his own family. He doesn't care. And that's what's so sad about all these people with this cultish devotion to him. They don't see, he didn't ask them to give money to J.D. Vance. No, he wasn't trying to help him. He was there promoting himself. The only reason, J.D. Vance is just an instrument of him promoting himself. He doesn't care one whit. The only reason he wants J.D. Vance to win is because he endorsed him, not because he cares.
Yeah, I mean, I guess for me, David Jelly is the only part of the story that doesn't bother me. He doesn't give a hoot about J.D. Vance because J.D. J.D. Vance is the candidate who Mitch McConnell has had to prop up with emergency money, and I think he's got a lot of funding from finance outside of Ohio. I mean, he's got literally zero grassroots support. He's a New York guy who tweets, "Oh, is New York scary now?" I mean, he's an absolute poser, a fraud who thinks women should stay in violent marriages and relationships because they're better for the kid. And Trump's message, I don't have it written down, but I did read the reporting. Trump's message was, I don't like him either. He one time said bad things about me, but you got to do what you got to do for this guy. And now I hope it's a colossal fail because the country is in danger with people like J.D. Vance in the United States Senate. Tim Ryan is running a very good campaign, and he's actually a much better match for Ohio. But the one of it is almost the secondary piece that alarms me. It is the fact that this happens in America, in Ohio, a state that matters, a state whose people deserve a lot more, than a bloated cult leader coming in and, as Claire said, trashing a candidate he's supposed to support. It is evidence. It is sort of a big reveal of the rot and, frankly, the danger of the modern GOP.
Yeah, Nicole, I commend you for your perfect assessment of J.D. Vance. And I think you're right. The political story here goes beyond even one emasculated U.S. Senate candidate on the stage in Ohio the other night. And it goes to the rise of Donald Trump, but it shines a spotlight on how uniquely dangerous Donald Trump really is as a Republican leader. That's not to say there are not other dangerous candidates emerging, certainly at the Secretary of State and some of the gubernatorial level candidates. But Donald Trump is a uniquely dangerous leader of the party for his willingness to tap into the conspiracy and ultimately violent demographic that has emerged as now having equity within today's GOP. And I think what is fascinating about this from a political lens, but also the security lens, is do look at how small that crowd was. Now, he was in Ohio. There was an Ohio State game. But listen, that was a very small crowd. And then secondly, look at the current approval numbers of Donald Trump. They're at the lowest point in his career, somewhere in the low 30s. This is a former president who might run again, who is now recognizing my support may be eroding past the point that I can regain it. And so what does he do? He goes where the customers are, which is the QAnon theory, or the QAnon crowd. And Frank is exactly right. This was not a spontaneous moment. Donald Trump and his team knew the music they were playing. They knew the response they were eliciting. And the danger here is, does Donald Trump truly believe that he needs to become a more high-profile leader of the Q movement going into what could be a political contest for the GOP nomination in 2024? And at this point, you would have to say, sure, probably so, because that's the audacity that he leads with. And it also suggests the wrestling match then between Donald Trump and Ron DeSantis or Mike Pence or whomever else decides they would like to be president of the United States. That wrestling match could be a real one, and it could happen here in the next 2 months by Election Day of this year.
David, let me just introduce one more thought I have. I actually believe that in 2016, if the Republican Party had to take on board QAnon and look the other way and vote for Trump anyway, they would have. And I say that because when he was grabbing women in the you-know-what, they didn't walk away. They didn't unendorse. They didn't demand that Pence become the nominee. And, you know, I don't think that, I think the story is what you just articulated, but it's also an emasculated Republican Party, a Mitch McConnell afraid of his own shadow and terrified to have to move offices if he's no longer the leader, and a Kevin McCarthy who left his spine down in Mar-a-Lago 3 weeks after the January 6th attack. They are the reason this happens. Mitch McConnell could say, I don't want him, anyone that he campaigns for will not get a dime. They can make it stop today. They can make it stop today. Right. And they choose to over and over and over again inject not just the sickness of a guy that'll take the QAnon customers, but a guy that is knowingly stoking domestic violence.
That's exactly right. The stain of Donald Trump and Trumpism reaches to Kevin McCarthy, Mitch McConnell, Lindsey Graham, Mike Pence, everybody who looked the other way and enabled him. The stain of January 6th, the stain of 2 impeachments, the stain of an erosion of America's respect for the judiciary and the press. That is their legacy as much as it is Donald Trump. And so they let this moment happen. It is theirs as much as it is his. But Donald Trump's the one that's leaning into it. And that is a remarkably unique danger right now.
Let me just put this out there. If Rob Portman or Mitch McConnell want to call in, I'll be on for another, hour and 40 minutes. If you want to condemn what you saw on TV, if you say that isn't who we are, our line is open. When we come back, the danger QAnon extremists pose to society is not just something that could happen. A very real crime wave is happening. It exists today. How what Trump says really does incite those who follow him. A reporter tracking that part of the story will join our conversation. Plus, New York Times with an important story on the threats to our democracy. Chief among them, Republicans' refusal to accept defeat in our elections. The author of that extraordinary front page piece of reporting, David Leonhardt, will be our guest on how the active threats to our democracy today are being exacerbated by Republican candidates right now. And later in the program, while the Justice Department and the ex-president continue with a legal back and forth over those classified documents Trump took to Mar-a-Lago, we'll look at how a pause in the investigation is putting U.S. national security interests at risk. All those stories and more when Deadline White House continues after a quick break Don't go anywhere.
What I can tell you is that within the domestic terrorism bucket category as a whole, racially motivated violent extremism is, I think, the biggest bucket within that larger group. And within the racially motivated violent extremist bucket, people ascribing to some kind of white supremacist type ideology is certainly the biggest chunk of that. I would also add to that racially motivated violent extremists over recent years have been responsible for the most lethal activity in the U.S. Now this year, the lethal attacks, domestic terrorism lethal attacks we have, I think, all fit in the category of anti-government, anti-authority, which covers everything from anarchist violent extremists to militia types.
That was FBI Director Christopher Wray, appointed by Donald J. Trump before Congress from September 2020, before the presidential election, pinpointing there in his testimony white supremacy as the single biggest threat within the domestic violent extremism bucket, which the FBI believes is the biggest overall terror threat facing the United States homeland. Joining our coverage on set, Ben Collins, NBC News senior political reporter. Ben, last week you tweeted this, and we pulled it up after the event of the weekend. A wave of QAnon-based terror this weekend. A Trump fan in a clown wig obsessed with the end times, you have to explain end times to us, threatened to kill all Democrats in a DQ. Dairy Queen?
Yep.
I love my blizzards. Another man riddled with Q delusions in Michigan shot up his family at home, injuring his daughter and killing his wife and killing his dog.
Yeah. People are wondering when it's going to happen, when the big next January 6th thing is going to happen. And we have this rolling wave of violence in this country by people who are obsessed with bringing back the previous time. And that can mean whatever they want. It can mean the 90s, it can mean the 50s, it can mean something much further back than that. But they think they are losing control of the culture, of their own power in society. And Donald Trump is giving them a way to get it back. So is QAnon, by the way. But that guy who shot his family, killed his wife, killed his dog, injured one of his daughters, his other daughter, went onto Reddit before news reports even came out about this. She went onto a thing called QAnon casualties. It's where people go when their family members have been consumed by QAnon. Not necessarily violent, stuff yet, but they are worried about their family members. And she said, QAnon did this to my dad. QAnon made him do this stuff. He was already a little, he had a screw loose beforehand, but this turned it into a full-on, violent movement for him. And for Donald Trump to lean into this literally days after that, right? For Donald Trump to say, push out a "where we go, when we go all" QAnon pinned tweet, or excuse me, truth, which is what he calls it. He can't tweet. He knows what this is. This is a guy who's losing control of the idea that he can be democratically elected again. But he still has an army, and he's afraid of being indicted. So put two and two together here.
And he's warned, he did it on the radio last week. He warned on the Hugh Hewitt show of what the country would do. I assume he means his hardcore followers. Tell me what happens in the QAnon world after an ex-president does what he did on Saturday. What happens? The sort of post 9/11 analysis was always an analysis of chatter, but those were classified, communications. I'm guessing in this domestic violent extremism universe that Chris Wray testified to, a lot of it is public facing and in social media forums.
Yeah, it's very public facing. They go to these communities called the dot wins, basically communities that were banned from Reddit, wind up on these spaces. So the Donald's on there's a QAnon forum, and the QAnon forum was dying. It was, as the prophecy became more and more ridiculous, this guy's supposed to be in power, he's supposed to be, locking everybody up. He's not even the president anymore. They were, dipping away from this thing. They've been reignited entirely in the last few weeks because he is playing to them. Now he's also playing all this music that, it's like this very religious experience at these spaces. And they're playing into that too. These people are playing around with numerology. They're playing around with the idea that he might be the second coming. That's the space we're in now with these spaces. Trust me, there are people who like Donald Trump for reasons that have nothing to do with this, I'm sure. But the very extreme parts of this base are both more energized than ever and less committed to voting than ever. So what are they going to do with that energy? And that's what we're about to find out, I think.
Frank, the picture gets more bleak when you start peeling back the layers. What is your sense from talking to your former colleagues at the FBI of how much of a handle they think they have on this in terms of all of the sort of rights and speech allows you to do a lot of this in full view. That's why it is public facing. But with this intersectionality of domestic violent extremism threat, does the FBI feel like they can get their arms around this before something violent happens?
The short one-word answer is no. The resources they've got on this already are stretched to the max. Every single field office, all 56 field offices involved in a big way in countering the domestic terror threat. But as you referenced, Nicole, they don't have the same tools in the toolbox as you have with international terrorism. We still don't have a law that makes it illegal to commit something called domestic terrorism. We actually define it in our law, but we don't have a law against it. So you're forced to use other laws, and that's great when the violence has occurred. But in terms of preemption, in terms of preventive work, getting out in front of it proactively, very challenging to use the undercover technique, electronic surveillance, and develop informants until someone in some chat room somewhere, maybe you've tripped over, maybe someone's pointed it to you, someone says, hey, they're talking about violence. That's a problem. It's the left of boom, as terrorism agents will say. You've got to act left of boom before the bomb goes off, not right of boom, or you're simply cleaning up the wreckage. And that is the concern today. Stretched to the max, lots of resources expended, but tools are not all there.
David Jolly, I don't expect anything of the Republican Party anymore. But this acquiescence to a climate that is a powder keg of domestic violence breaking out without any tools feels like it's like Russian roulette. It could hurt anybody. It could hurt anyone's family. Yeah. Why are they so impotent?
I would suggest it's not impotence, it's not acquiescence, it's actually participation. And here's the very nuanced affiliation that mainstream Republicans, quote unquote mainstream Republicans, are making with Donald Trump and the conspiracy theorists and the alt-right and the white supremacy and that whole dark crowd. And it's this: the candidates today in today's Republican Party are not presenting to the nation what they think the next marginal tax rate should be or how we pay for health care. They are embarking upon culture wars. And at the root of a culture war is this: your culture, white America, is being taken from you. Your culture, Christian America, is being taken from you. And from Donald Trump to the Republicans, we are not going to let someone take your white Christian culture from you. And therefore, we are going to empower these culture war fights. Well, these culture war fights in the hands of the Proud Boys actually leads to violence. But where does it start? It starts with 8 weeks before an election, like we saw in 18 and 20 and now in 2022, this notion that somehow immigration is the greatest problem we face, that brown people are coming across the border at us. They are participating in this narrative. They're not acquiescing to it.
Wow. Ben Collins, Frank Figliuzzi, David Jolly. It's a terrifying way to start, but I'm really grateful to all of you for having this conversation. You have shaken me to my core. Thank you. Claire sticks around after the break for us. This moment for Donald Trump and the rest of us put into really exquisite historical context. Our next guest details 2 reasons why what we are living through right now represents the greatest threat to our country's governing ideals in decades. Those 2 reasons and what we can do about it is our next story. Don't go anywhere. So if you had the chance to read the physical paper of the Sunday New York Times this weekend, this is what you saw staring back at you. Front page, above the fold, this striking large headline: Democracy Challenged. Twin threats to governing ideals put America in uncharted territory. From that extraordinary piece of reporting by our friend David Leonhardt, this: the first threat is acute. A growing movement inside one of the country's 2 major parties, the Republican Party, to refuse to accept defeat in an election. The second threat to democracy is chronic but also growing. The power to set government policy is becoming increasingly disconnected from public opinion. Joining us now, the author of that new piece, New York Times senior writer David Leonhardt. David, thank you so much for being here. I just confessed that the first time I picked up, the story was online before my paper arrived, and I went to read it, and I got depressed, and so I waited till my paper came in the morning, and I read it in the paper. It's really important, though. Take me through these two serious blows to our democracy.
Yeah, it's very alarming. I mean, I think of myself as an American optimist. I think the long-term history of the United States mostly offer reasons for optimism. But this is really worrisome. So, as you said, there are basically two threats. One is the immediate threat, and in the short term, it's the much more worrisome one, which is the idea that large numbers of the Republican Party have signaled that they will not necessarily accept defeat in an election. And the reason this is worrisome is that it raises the possibility that in a future election, potentially as soon as a 2022 race or a 2024 presidential race, Republicans will try to overturn the result the same way Donald Trump tried and failed in 2020. This is just way outside of the norm of American politics and history. Al Gore lost a close, disputed election to George Bush, and he said, okay, it's time to move on. George Bush is the president. Richard Nixon lost a close and in some circles disputed election in 1960 to John F. Kennedy. And he said, okay, I lost. John F. Kennedy is the president. We just didn't have, until very recently, major figures in parties suggesting or even outright saying they would not accept defeat. The second problem is chronic. And in some ways it's built into the Constitution, but for reasons we can get into if you want, it's become just much more problematic now. The Democratic Party has won 7 of the last 8 popular vote in the presidential election. That's an unprecedented streak. No other party has ever done that well. Before this, the best any party had done is 6 out of 8. And the previous parties that have done so well, the Reagan Republicans, which won legitimate landslides, the FDR New Deal Democrats, Thomas Jefferson's Democrat Republicans, the Abe Lincoln Republican Party, when those parties won the popular vote, they got to govern. And for a set of reasons, basically, we now have this disconnect between the popular vote and election outcomes in a way that we have never had before. In the past, we had all kinds of restrictions on who could vote and who was a citizen. Black Americans were excluded, women were excluded. But among the people who could vote, popular sentiment tended to guide who won elections. And now we're seeing a disconnect.
And it is so acute, and I thought of the Supreme Court when I read that section. I don't want to skim over the first one though, and then we'll come back to this, which is really structural in nature. You write that over the sweep of history, the American government has tended to become more democratic through women's suffrage, civil rights laws, the direct election of senators, and more. The exceptions, like the post-Reconstruction period when black Southerners lost rights, have been rare. The current period is so striking, partly because it is one of those exceptions. There's so much about what you pulled together that, like your point about popular elections, hasn't happened before. Tell me your degree of alarm as you sort of peel back the layers to this. You know, we say these things on cable TV. We're never positive they're true, but it feels like we are in uncharted territory.
I think we are, and which isn't to say that things are worse than they've ever been. In many ways, our democracy is much more inclusive than it was in the past. I mean, in the living memory of large numbers of Americans, there were many parts of this country where black Americans could not vote, right? In the living memory of our grandparents, women could not vote. So I'm not saying that American democracy is worse than it's ever been. By some measures, it's better than it's been for the vast majority of our history. I think this notion, though, that you have large portions of a party signaling that it might not be willing to accept defeat in an election, that is a fundamental tenet of democracy. And I think a huge part of what will determine where this goes is, one, what about the rest of the Republican Party? We're not talking about all Republicans. According to 538 calculations, something like 40% of Republicans running for office this year are election deniers. That leaves 60 who are not. About 10% kind of play footsie with it. So let's say 50 who are not. Mitch McConnell has been pretty strong on this. He said there is no evidence of widespread voter fraud. The Supreme Court, whatever you want to say about its other decisions, refused to get involved in the 2020 election. And so I think one of the most important group is going to be these Republicans who have not yet signed on to this radical movement to deny elections, and what are they going to do? And then I think liberals and Democrats also have an important role to play here, because it's important to remember that you can disagree on all kinds of issues and still accept democracy. So just to be clear, being opposed to gun control is not anti-democratic. Being opposed to abortion is not anti-democratic. Being in favor of low tax rates for the rich, none of those views are anti-democratic. And I think it's going to be important for Democrats to think about, how do we build a big enough tent to protect our democracy? And have people in that tent with whom we disagree strongly on all kinds of high stakes issues, but we all believe in democracy, and we can live to fight another day in the political realm over those issues. But we have no hope if we lose this notion that we are in a democracy where the winner of an election, the rightful winner of an election, gets to take power.
You know, Claire, to David's point, there are disagreements around the three issues he cited. But what Republicans want is for them not to be decided in democratic ways. I mean, they have pushed through, predicated on the big lie, hundreds of laws to change access to the polls. And I want to read you something, Claire. We did our first show on the danger to democracy on this program on September 30th, 2020. Do you remember this, Claire? I won't put you on the spot. I'll remind you. Trump had been asked by Chris Wallace the day before if he would accept the results of the election. And he said this, quote, "I'm urging my supporters to go to the polls and watch very carefully, because that's what has to happen. I'm urging them to do it. I'm urging my people. I hope it's going to be a fair election. If it's a fair election, I'm 100% on board. But if I see tens of thousands being manipulated, I can't go along with that." Headline was that he didn't commit to accepting the results of the election. One of what David reports out is one of the two big threats to our democracy. Claire, you said this: "I believe that in his heart he's a coward. This is not a man of great courage. I think he's a phony. I think he's looking for a fig leaf. I believe he thinks he's going to lose, and he wants to have an excuse because he doesn't want to confront that. He's going to be rejected by the American people." That has infected, in David's numbers, he wrote down 40% of the Republicans running are election deniers, plus 10 that are playing footsie with us. Even my weak math skills gives me 50% of all Republican candidates are in that position that Trump was in September of 2020. How do we, it's a nosedive for democracy. How do we get out of this?
Well, first let me say I have great respect for David and his work on this piece. And I consumed it, then I went and threw up, and then I thought about it. Because it is so hard for me, having been part of government for so long, watching it go off the rails like this. And I got to say, he just said in the segment a minute ago, major figures in parties. And it really isn't major figures in parties. It's just one man. Donald Trump did this. He is solely and whole. Now, there are other Republicans that are aiding and abetting him at this point and enabling him at this point and emulating him at this point. But make no mistake about it. This norm, you cited, Richard Nixon accepted it. Al Gore accepted it. Hillary Clinton lost the popular vote, never said I didn't, I was really elected. She didn't do that. I mean, no one had ever in America done what this man did. He is solely and completely responsible, and I will not do both sides on this one. It's Donald Trump and just Donald Trump.
David Leonhardt, Claire McCaskill.